Have you ever been humiliated by someone who was supposed to protect you? Have you ever stood there, silent, while someone stripped away your dignity piece by piece, knowing that if you fought back, you'd lose everything you had left? I have. And I can still feel the weight of that moment even now years later when I close my eyes and let myself remember the fluorescent lights overhead, the smell of disinfectant mixed with something metallic and old, the way my hands trembled at my sides while Officer Garrett stood inches from my face, her voice low and cutting, telling me exactly what she thought I was worth. 0. Less than 0. Inmate 4729. That's what they called me. Not my name. Not who I was before. Just a number stitched onto a uniform that never quite fit right, that scratched at my neck every single day for 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. It was a Tuesday morning in January when everything changed. The kind of morning where the cold seeps through concrete walls and settles into your bones, where you wake up already tired, already defeated before the day has even begun. I remember the exact sound my boots made on the linoleum floor as I walked toward the medical bay for my shift, that rubber squeak that echoed down the empty hallway. And I remember thinking about my daughter, about how she would be 10 years old in 6 days, and how I wouldn't be there to see her blow out the candles, wouldn't be there to brush her hair or tell her she was beautiful, wouldn't be there to explain why Mama had to go away. The judge had called it vehicular manslaughter. I called it the worst moment of my life, the moment I looked down at my phone for 3 seconds, just 3 seconds to read a text from my daughter's school, and when I looked up, there was a man in the crosswalk, and it was too late. Too late, too late. He died. I went to prison. And every single day since then, I carried the weight of that choice like stones in my pockets. But Officer Garrett didn't care about any of that. She didn't care that I had been a pediatric nurse before, that I had spent 12 years of my life helping children breathe easier, sleep safer, heal faster. She didn't care that I cried myself to sleep every night for the first 8 months. She didn't care that I followed every rule, kept my head down, worked my shifts in the infirmary without complaint, tried to be invisible. To her, I was just another inmate who thought she was better than everyone else because I had an education, because I spoke properly, because I didn't fit the stereotype of what a prisoner should be. And she made it her personal mission to remind me, every single day, that I was nothing. The morning it happened, I was preparing medication trays in the infirmary, counting pills into small paper cups, writing names and times on labels with handwriting that had become smaller and tighter over the years, as if I could make myself disappear through the very act of writing. The infirmary was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator where we kept the insulin, and the occasional cough from one of the women waiting to be seen. I liked the quiet. I liked the routine. It was the only time I felt almost like myself. Almost human, almost like the person I used to be before the accident turned my entire life into a series of before and after photographs that would never line up again. Officer Garrett came in without knocking. She never knocked. That was part of her power play, the way she would burst into spaces and demand attention, demand submission, demand that you acknowledge her authority by interrupting whatever small moment of peace you might have found. She walked right up to the medication cart and stood there, arms crossed, watching me with those cold gray eyes that never seemed to blink, never seemed to see anything remotely human when they looked at you. Well, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. Look at Inmate 4729 playing nurse. You think you're special, don't you? You think because you had a fancy job on the outside that you're better than the rest of these women? I kept my eyes down. I had learned, painfully and slowly, that responding only made things worse. That silence was sometimes the only form of resistance available to you when someone held all the power and you held none. I asked you a question. 4729. No, ma'am, I said quietly, my hands still moving, still counting, still labeling, because if I stopped working, she would write me up for insubordination or laziness or any of the dozen infractions she had already documented in my file. No, ma'am, she mimicked, her voice high and mocking. You make me sick. You know that? Women like you, thinking you can just waltz back into society after you kill someone, thinking you deserve a second chance. You don't deserve anything. But that was only the beginning. She reached over and swept her arm across the medication cart, sending pills scattering across the floor, little white and blue and pink tablets rolling under cabinets and chairs. 3 hours of careful work destroyed in a single gesture. The other inmates waiting for treatment went silent. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. "Clean it up," she said. "And do it right, or I'll make sure you spend the next week in solitary for destroying prison property." I got down on my knees. I picked up every single pill I could find, my face burning with shame, my eyes stinging with tears I refused to let fall because I knew she was watching. Knew she wanted to see me break, wanted to see me cry, wanted proof that she had won. And while I was down there on the floor, while I was gathering medication that could no longer be used because it had touched the ground, because it was contaminated now, useless, she stood over me and laughed. Actually laughed. Have you ever felt something like this? That moment when you realize that no matter how good you try to be, no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you've already lost, there are people in this world who will never see you as worthy of basic human dignity. I felt it that morning, felt it settle into my chest like ice, felt something inside me go very quiet and very still. Before I tell you why that moment changed everything, let me take you back. Let me tell you who I was before I became inmate 4729, before the accident, before the trial, before the orange jumpsuit and the cold concrete and the endless counting of days. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where my mother worked 3 jobs to keep us fed after my father left, where I learned early that being smart was my only way out. I studied harder than anyone else in my class. I graduated valedictorian. I got a full scholarship to nursing school, and I promised myself that I would never, ever let anyone make me feel small again. I met my husband, Daniel, during my first year of nursing school. He was studying architecture, and we would meet in the library at midnight when we were both exhausted and running on coffee and desperation, and we would whisper our dreams to each other between the stacks of books. He wanted to design schools. I wanted to work in pediatric oncology. We got married 2 weeks after graduation in a courthouse ceremony with just our mothers as witnesses, and 3 years later, our daughter Lily was born, with dark eyes like her father and a smile that could light up entire rooms. For 12 years, I lived the life I had dreamed of. I worked at Children's Hospital. I held babies who couldn't breathe and helped them fight for every single breath. I comforted parents in the worst moments of their lives. I was good at what I did. I mattered. I made a difference. And then one afternoon, one stupid, thoughtless afternoon, I looked at my phone while driving, and everything I had built, everything I was, everything I loved, shattered like glass. The trial lasted 6 days. The prosecution showed pictures of the victim, a 63-year-old grandfather named Thomas Chen, who had been walking to meet his daughter for lunch. They showed his family crying. They showed the damage to my car. They showed the text message on my phone, still open, still glowing on the screen. Parent-teacher conference rescheduled to Thursday at 3 p.m. 11 words, 3 seconds, 1 life ended. Mine destroyed. My lawyer argued for probation, community service, anything but prison. But the judge looked at me with the same expression Officer Garrett would wear years later. Looked at me like I was something broken and dangerous, something that needed to be locked away where I couldn't hurt anyone else. 7 years? That's what she gave me. 7 years for vehicular manslaughter. My daughter was 4 years old. She would be 11 by the time I got out. Daniel promised to bring her to visit, promised to keep our family together. But I could see it in his eyes even then, the way he looked at me, like he didn't know who I was anymore. Like I had become a stranger. Inside, I learned quickly that there were rules beyond the official rules, hierarchies and territories and invisible lines you crossed at your own peril. I learned to keep my head down, to speak only when spoken to make myself as small and unremarkable as possible. I learned that being educated made you a target, that other women resented you for having had opportunities they never had, for having thrown away a life they would have killed for. I learned that guards could be just as cruel as inmates, sometimes worse, because they had the system backing them up, had the weight of authority making their cruelty legal, acceptable, just part of the job. And I learned about Officer Garrett. She had been working at the prison for 18 years, had started as a corrections officer right out of high school, and worked her way up to senior officer, and she was known for being hard, unforgiving, the kind of guard who would write you up for anything, who seemed to take personal pleasure in exercising her power over women who had none. Some of the older inmates said she had been different once, softer, that something had happened to change her, but no one knew what, and no one dared to ask. She singled me out from my first week. Maybe it was because I was educated. Maybe it was because I tried to follow the rules. Maybe it was because I represented something she hated, some version of success or normality that she had never had or had lost. Whatever the reason, she made my life miserable in 1,000 small ways. She would wake me up in the middle of the night for random cell inspections. She would assign me the worst work details, the ones that left you exhausted and aching. She would accidentally lose my mail from my daughter, claiming it must have been misplaced by the sorting room. She would stand outside my cell and make comments just loud enough for me to hear, about how murderers didn't deserve comfortable beds, didn't deserve hot meals, didn't deserve to breathe the same air as decent people. I took it all. I endured. I survived. Because what choice did I have? Fighting back meant losing privileges, meant losing the ability to call my daughter, meant adding time to my sentence for disciplinary infractions. So I swallowed my pride, I swallowed my anger, I swallowed my sense of self, and I became exactly what they wanted me to be: invisible, obedient, broken. But here's the thing about breaking. Sometimes, when you've been broken down far enough, when you've lost everything except the smallest, hardest core of who you are, something crystallizes inside you. Not rebellion exactly. Not defiance. Just a quiet, stubborn refusal to disappear completely. And that was the moment I stopped being who they thought I was. 3 months after the medication cart incident, on a morning in April, when spring was trying to push through the concrete and razor wire, when the air smelled almost fresh for once, almost alive, I was doing my usual rounds in the infirmary. We had a small storage room in the back where we kept supplies, bandages and gauze and alcohol swabs. Nothing controlled, nothing dangerous. But it needed to be organized weekly because the day shift nurses were sloppy, and everything would end up jumbled together. I was in there counting boxes of sterile gloves when I heard a sound from the main infirmary that didn't belong. A thud. Heavy. Like something large falling. I came out of the storage room and saw Officer Garrett on the floor, her body convulsing, her eyes rolled back, foam at the corners of her mouth. Seizure. My nursing training kicked in before my brain could even process what I was seeing. Before I could remember that this was the woman who had made my life hell for almost 3 years, who had humiliated me, degraded me, treated me like I was less than human. I dropped to my knees beside her. I turned her on her side to keep her airway clear. I checked her pulse, rapid and thready, checked her color, pale and getting paler. The seizure lasted maybe 90 seconds, but it felt like forever, felt like the entire universe had contracted down to just this moment, just this woman's body fighting against itself, just my hands knowing what to do, even when my mind was screaming conflicting instructions. When the seizure stopped, she didn't wake up. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak. I yelled for help, yelled for anyone, but the infirmary was in the far wing and no one could hear. Me. The emergency alarm was on the wall 20 feet away, but I couldn't leave her, couldn't risk her seizing again, couldn't risk her aspirating, couldn't risk her dying because I chose my safety over her life. And in that moment, kneeling there beside the woman who hated me, I had a choice. I could have walked away. I could have pressed the alarm and waited for someone else to take responsibility. I could have let the universe balance the scales in some cosmic version of justice. She had shown me no mercy. I owed her nothing. And yet, I couldn't. Because I was a nurse before I was an inmate. Because I had taken an oath to do no harm. Because somewhere deep inside me, beneath all the pain and humiliation and anger, there was still a person who believed that every life mattered. Even the lives of people who hurt you. Even the lives of people who saw you as less than human. I stayed with her. I monitored her breathing. I kept her airway clear. When her pulse started to drop, I began chest compressions, counting out loud, the way I had been trained: 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 30 compressions, 2 breaths. My hands remembering the rhythm even though it had been years since I had performed CPR, years since I had been allowed to be a nurse instead of just a number. Finally, I heard footsteps running down the hall. 3 guards burst into the infirmary, saw me kneeling over Officer Garrett, saw me with my hands on her chest. And for one terrible moment, I thought they were going to assume I had attacked her. Thought I was going to spend the rest of my sentence in solitary or worse, thought I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. But then the medical card arrived, and the prison doctor, an overworked man in his 60s named Dr. Morrison, who had always been kind to me, took one look at the scene and understood immediately what had happened. He took over the CPR while I gave him the report, clinical and precise, onset time, duration of seizure, respiratory status, cardiac status, everything he needed to know. The paramedics arrived 7 minutes later. They got her stabilized. They loaded her onto a stretcher. And as they were wheeling her out, her eyes fluttered open for just a second, unfocused and confused, but open, alive. I didn't know it yet, but the world was about to change. They questioned me for hours. Procedure, they said. Had to make sure I hadn't caused the seizure, hadn't given her something, hadn't taken advantage of the situation. I sat in a small gray room with 2 internal affairs officers and answered every question with the same calm precision I had used for the medical report. No, I didn't give her anything. No, I don't have access to controlled substances. No, I didn't touch her before the seizure started. Yes, I performed CPR. Yes, I tried to save her life. Yes, I understand that it looks suspicious. No, I can't prove my innocence beyond what I've already told you. Finally, Dr. Morrison came in. He had reviewed the security footage. He had confirmed my story. Officer Garrett had an undiagnosed heart condition that had triggered the seizure. The CPR I performed had kept her alive long enough for the paramedics to arrive. Without my intervention, she would have died. He told this to the internal affairs officers in a voice that left no room for argument. And then he looked at me with something I hadn't seen in anyone's eyes for 3 years. Respect. I went back to my cell that night and sat on my bunk in the dark, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline, my mind replaying the moment over and over. The weight of her body under my hands, the sound of her breath catching, the terrible fragility of a human life. Any human life, even the life of someone who hated you. Stay with me until the end. It's worth it, I promise. Officer Garrett was in the hospital for 5 days. During that time, the story spread through the prison like wildfire. Inmate 4729 had saved Officer Garrett's life. The guard who hated her, who had made her life miserable, who had humiliated her in front of everyone. And the inmate had saved her anyway. The other women didn't know what to make of it. Some of them thought I was stupid, thought I should have let her die, thought I had missed my chance at cosmic justice. But some of them, the ones who had been nurses or mothers or caregivers on the outside, the ones who understood what it meant to put someone else's life above your own feelings, they looked at me differently. They saw something in me that they recognized, something that prison hadn't managed to destroy. When Officer Garrett came back to work 2 weeks later, she was assigned to light duty, administrative work only, doctor's orders. She didn't come near the infirmary. She didn't come near me. I thought maybe that was how it would end, with silence, with distance, with the incident quietly filed away and forgotten. But then one morning, 3 weeks after the seizure, I was called to the warden's office. That never happened. Inmates didn't get called to the warden's office unless something was very wrong or very unusual. I walked down the long hallway, my heart pounding, my mind racing through every possible scenario, every possible thing I might have done wrong, every possible reason why this was about to get worse. The warden's secretary told me to sit and wait. I sat, I waited. And then the door opened and Officer Garrett came out, and for the first time in 3 years, she looked me directly in the eyes. Not through me, not past me, at me. "Inmate 4729, she said, and her voice was different, quieter, almost unsure. "The warden wants to see you." I stood up, I walked into the office. Warden Patricia Michaels was a woman in her 50s who had a reputation for being fair but firm, someone who believed in rehabilitation but also in consequences. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down," she said. Not unkindly. I sat. "I've reviewed the incident report from 3 weeks ago," she said. "And I've read Dr. Morrison's statement. You saved Officer Garrett's life." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "Officer Garrett has also submitted a report. She's asked me to read it to you." Warden Michaels picked up a piece of paper and began to read. And this is what it said. "I have spent 18 years working in corrections. I have seen the worst of humanity. I have become hard because this job requires hardness, because showing weakness in this environment is dangerous, because I believed that maintaining order meant maintaining distance, meant never seeing the inmates as fully human. I was wrong. Inmate 4729 Marissa Chen had every reason to let me die. I treated her with cruelty. I abused my authority. I used my power to make her life miserable because she represented something I envied, something I had lost, something I could never have. And when my life was in her hands, when she could have chosen revenge, she chose compassion. She chose to see me as a human being even when I never extended her the same courtesy. I am requesting that her file be amended to reflect her exemplary behavior. I am requesting that she be considered for early parole. And I am requesting a meeting with her, if she is willing, so that I can apologize properly for my actions. The silence in that office was absolute. I felt something break open inside my chest, something that had been locked tight for 3 years, something that felt like grief and relief and disbelief all mixed together. "She's waiting outside," Warden Michaels said quietly. "Would you like to speak with her?" I nodded. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up completely. Officer Garrett came back in. She sat in the chair next to mine. She looked at her hands. And then she said, "I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. For everything. You deserved better. You deserved basic human decency, and I failed to give you that. You saved my life when you had every reason not to, and I will never forget that. I will never forget what it feels like to owe someone your life when you've spent years trying to make them suffer. Share this with someone who would understand what this moment meant, what it feels like to be seen for the first time in years." I looked at her. This woman who had been my tormentor, my nightmare, the face of everything unjust about my situation, and I saw what I hadn't been able to see before. I saw someone who was also broken, someone who had built walls so high and so thick that she couldn't remember what it felt like to be vulnerable, to be kind, to make mistakes and be forgiven for them. "I didn't save your life because I'm a good person," I heard myself say. "I saved your life because it was the right thing to do, and because I'm a nurse. That's who I am, underneath everything else. That's who I was before, and that's who I still am, even here." Officer Garrett nodded. She was crying now, tears running down her face, her shoulders shaking with the effort of holding it together. "You showed me more grace than I ever showed you," she said. "And I will spend the rest of my career trying to be worthy of that." 3 months later, I was released on early parole. The parole board reviewed my case, reviewed the incident report, reviewed the letter from Officer Garrett and the recommendation from Dr. Morrison and the warden. They looked at my record of good behavior, my work in the infirmary, the fact that I had saved a life when I could have walked away. They granted me parole after serving 3 years and 9 months of my 7-year sentence. I walked out of that prison on a morning in July when the sun was bright and the air was hot and everything smelled like possibility. My daughter was waiting for me outside the gates. She was 10 years old now, tall and beautiful and a little shy, unsure if she was allowed to hug me, unsure if I was still the same person she remembered. I knelt down and pulled her into my arms and breathed in the smell of her hair, her skin, her aliveness, and I thought I might die from the sheer, overwhelming joy of it, the privilege of being able to hold her again. Daniel was there too. We were divorced by then. The papers had been finalized while I was inside, but he had brought her, had kept his promise to maintain some kind of connection, some kind of family, even if it didn't look the way we had once planned. He nodded at me. I nodded back. And that was enough. That was more than enough. I rebuilt my life slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild something precious that has been shattered. I couldn't work as a nurse anymore. My license had been revoked, but I found work as a medical assistant at a community health clinic, helping people who couldn't afford proper health care, people who were marginalized and forgotten and desperate. I was good at it. I understood them. I understood what it felt like to be invisible, to be judged, to be reduced to your worst moment. And I rebuilt my relationship with my daughter, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, trust earned back one small gesture at a time. She asked me questions about prison, about what it was like, about whether I was still the same mama she remembered. And I told her the truth. I told her about Officer Garrett. I told her about the seizure. I told her about the choice I had made, and why I had made it, and what it had taught me. "Did you forgive her?" Lily asked me one night, curled up on the couch together, her head on my shoulder. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Forgiveness is complicated, but I chose not to let her hate define me. I chose not to let her cruelty make me cruel. And maybe that's not the same as forgiveness, but it's something. It's enough to let me breathe again." Officer Garrett and I stayed in contact. She sent me letters, updating me on her work, telling me about changes she was trying to implement in the prison, more training on mental health, more emphasis on rehabilitation instead of punishment. She told me she had started seeing a therapist, working through her own trauma, her own reasons for becoming so hard, so closed off. She told me I had changed her life, and maybe I did. Or maybe she changed her own life and I was just the catalyst, the mirror that showed her what she had become. Either way, something shifted between us, something that transformed both of our lives in ways neither of us could have predicted. 5 years later, I received an invitation to speak at a conference on prison reform. Officer Garrett, who now went by her first name, Susan, was one of the organizers. She had left corrections work and was working for a nonprofit, focused on improving conditions for incarcerated women, focused on training corrections officers to see inmates as human beings, focused on changing the culture that had allowed her to abuse her power for so many years. I stood on that stage and told our story, not to make myself look like a hero, not to shame Susan or anyone else, but to show what transformation looks like, what redemption looks like, what happens when people choose humanity over hatred, even when it's hard, even when it goes against every instinct, every justified anger, every right to revenge. After the talk, Susan came up to me, we hugged, and she whispered in my ear, "Thank you for saving my life, not just that day, but every day since." "Thank you for letting me save it," I whispered back, "for letting me remember who I was, who I still am." That's the thing about dignity. It's not something anyone can give you or take away. It's something you choose every single day, in every single moment. I chose dignity when I was on my knees picking up pills from the floor. I chose dignity when I performed CPR on someone who hated me. I chose dignity when I walked out of prison and faced a world that would always see me as a convicted criminal, always judge me for my worst moment, always question whether I deserved a second chance. And in choosing dignity for myself, I somehow gave Susan permission to choose it too. To step back from the person she had become, the person that prison had made her, and remember that underneath the uniform and the hardness and the armor, she was still human too, still capable of change, still worthy of grace. I think about Thomas Chen sometimes, the man I killed, the grandfather who was walking to meet his daughter for lunch. I think about how his family will never get him back, how my moment of carelessness destroyed their lives in ways I can never repair. I carry that weight every single day. It has become part of who I am, part of my story, part of my responsibility. But I also think about how his death, terrible and senseless as it was, somehow created a chain of events that led to Susan's life being saved, that led to changes in the prison system, that led to hundreds of women being treated with more dignity and respect, because Susan learned through me what it meant to extend grace even when it wasn't earned, even when it wasn't deserved. I don't know if that matters. I don't know if it balances any cosmic scales. I don't know if Thomas Chen's family would find any comfort in knowing that his death indirectly led to something good. But I know that we are all connected in ways we can't always see or understand, that our actions ripple outward in directions we never intended, that sometimes the worst moments of our lives contain seeds of transformation that won't bloom for years. My daughter is 15 now. She wants to be a social worker, wants to help families stay together, wants to work in the spaces between justice and mercy, where real change happens. She tells me that my story, my experience, taught her that people are more than their worst mistakes, that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, that grace is not weakness but the hardest and most powerful choice we can make. And when she says that, when I see the woman she is becoming, I think maybe, just maybe, something good came out of all that suffering. Maybe Thomas Chen's death and my imprisonment and Susan's transformation and my daughter's compassion are all threads in a story that's bigger than any of us, a story about what it means to be human in a world that often seems designed to strip away our humanity. Respect does not erase the past. It simply teaches us how to breathe again, to stand up straight, to look people in the eye, to know that you are more than the worst thing you've ever done, more than the lowest moment you've ever experienced, more than the number they gave you when they tried to make you disappear. I am not Inmate 4729 anymore, but I was. And that is part of my story, part of my truth, part of what made me who I am today. I don't hide from it. I don't pretend it didn't happen. I carry it with me the way you carry scars. Visible proof that you survived something that tried to break you, that you came out the other side, changed but not destroyed, wounded but not defeated. And Susan? She carries her own scars now. The shame of who she used to be, the weight of the women she hurt before she learned better, the knowledge that she needed someone she had tormented to show her what grace looked like. But she carries it forward, not as a burden, but as a responsibility, as a reminder of why her work matters, why changing systems and hearts and minds is worth every difficult conversation, every uncomfortable truth, every moment of facing what you've done wrong and choosing to do better. Truth does not shout. It simply waits to be heard. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, if we're very brave, we learn to speak it before it's too late, before the seizures come, before the moments pass, before the chances for connection and redemption and transformation slip through our fingers like water. If stories like this remind you what dignity feels like, subscribe. You belong here. And don't miss the next story. It is something truly unforgettable.